1 second. Unmute me.
Okay.
Okay.
Unmute.
All right, welcome everyone. Welcome back to Concordia University's Force-Space, and thank you for joining us for today's event. Who am I? Who am I? Yeah, there we go. It's a part of our book club. So to help situate you, we're streaming to YouTube. We are live from Force-Space. We're located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal. You may have gathered by now, we work with our university community at Force-Space to help mobilize knowledge with daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things in development across the university. You may have also noticed that we are running this event as a live stream Zoom meeting. We welcome comments and questions there via the chat. Those of you in the space, when we get a question period, just raise your hand, we'll get a microphone over to you. With that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Deborah Marcogliese from the Montreal West Public Library. Deborah, welcome in.
Thank you very much. First of all, we're very, very pleased to be here. Thank you to Kim and Bold for letting the Montreal West Book Club come and have a Who Am AI book club meeting here. I want to just say a little bit about this book club. This book club was the brainchild of Marlene Chan, who is here, who thought, what better way to learn about AI than through fiction? And as a librarian and an avid reader, I could not agree more. This event is co-hosted, as I said, by the Montreal West Public Library. We've been hosting the AI Book Club, which we host every couple of months at the Montreal West Public Library. So we are very pleased today to welcome the award-winning author, Sean Michaels. Sean is a recipient of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, the QWF Paragraph Hugh McLennan Prize, the Grand Prix Numériques, and the Prix Nouvelle Écriture. Born in Scotland, Sean has considered Montreal home for the last 20 years. Sean's most recent novel, Do You Remember Being Born?, was described by Wired magazine as the definitive novel about AI in the age of AI. So let's please welcome Sean Michaels reading from his work, Do You Remember Being Born?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Deborah.
You're very welcome.
And thank you to the library and to Concordia for having me. But really, thank you all for making time on this Monday afternoon to be here together. I'm going to just get right into it and read a little bit, two little excerpts from this novel. It's called Do You Remember Being Born? And it's the story of a 75-year-old poet named Charlotte. And Charlotte is a tall woman who lives in Manhattan and wears a cape and a tricorn hat and has spent her whole life writing poetry and receiving all the kind of thin rewards that being a lifelong poet can offer you. And as the book opens here, well, I think it's pretty much self-explanatory. The only other thing I'd add is that she has a son named Courtney. The letter came just as I was despairing. I was sitting at the little table in my kitchen, a hand over my face, considering what I should do. The room was all white and green, as it always is, as I like to keep it, but I felt none of its whiteness and greenness now. I felt midnight blue. I did not know how to help my son. Should I sell the apartment? Where then would I go? Or my archive? I had not planned to sell this until later, when I can no longer write. A retirement fund, grocery money. I did not have savings. No poet has savings unless they are born to wealth. I had my papers. I had my apartment, mother's apartment. And that was all. A diamond brooch, the Cynthia Davis print on my bedroom wall, given to me when we were both young. I would not finish my new collection until the new year, and even then, what is a new collection worth? It would keep me in bread and butter, and maybe kiwi fruit and wine, tinned salmon, aged cheddar, the occasional curry from Queen's Thai. Perhaps some new clothes now and then. Of course, I was being parsimonious. I could wear the wardrobe I had. I could buy cheaper wine. But then, couldn't I also decline to contribute? What did it matter if I gave Courtney $10 or $20 or $50,000? He would buy a house all the same, just a smaller one. He had his own savings, and his father would contribute, and also I had the impression Lucy's parents were giving them money. Courtney would be well sorted. I did not need to give him anything. I did not need to sell my home, nor to bequeath the cardboard banker's boxes in the bedroom closet, the ones full of unpublished poems and emails from colleagues that I printed sometimes in moments of procrastination and vanity. Not yet. But oh, I felt terrible. I felt like a paper thing, a folded bird. I felt humiliated that I could not help him, that I had not sufficiently prepared. It's all right, I didn't expect her to be able to contribute, Courtney would say to Lucy, and she would nod her head. The son of a poet grows up knowing his mother will not take care of him, not in certain ways. Courtney was 39 now. This wasn't the first time he had been forced to forge his own path through the world. The screen of my tablet flashed, only the flash was not to something brighter, but something darker. Is there a word for that, I wondered? A dimming? A death? I finished the dregs of my black tea. The doorbell sang. A courier stood in the hallway, looking doltish. "Marion Farmer?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "thank you," and drew an ampersand on his electronic clipboard. The envelope he gave me was slender and well made. My father was a stationer, and he taught me to recognize quality. Part of me, the part of me that came from him, the farmer part, preferred not to tear open the seal. I could leave the envelope here on the little desk by the door, a closed and handsome object. "I'm a closed and handsome object," I said to no one, to the room. I ripped the envelope open with the stinging end of my finger. I had not been prepared for the way aging changed my hands, made it hurt to open a letter. I unfolded the contents, 2 sheets stapled, the letterhead of one of the most valuable companies in the world, a company whose services I used online many times a day. I had no idea why they were writing me. I awaited something pro forma, purely administrative, yet. "Dear Marion Farmer," the letter began, "you are one of the great writers of this century." The company was asking me to collaborate with them on a poem, an historic partnership between human and machine. 1 week in California, composing a long poem with a 2.5 trillion parameter neural network, which is to say an artificial intelligence, a robot, a genie in a bottle. Excerpts from the finished work would be published internationally, with the complete poem appearing online. The letter concluded by stating that they would be pleased to offer me $65,000 for my contribution. I examined the signature, one of the company's vice presidents, an elegant and extravagant name rendered in sapphire-colored ink. "Dear Lausanne," I replied in an email that afternoon, "I was happy to receive your letter." I went into the bedroom. I stared at the print from Cynthia, a portrait of me at 25, before I had failed at anything. I'm just going to jump forward and read a little bit from later in the book, after Marion has flown to Silicon Valley and met this strange AI in a room called the Mind Studio, and this little poetry bot that is alive or not alive in some strange way. The bot's name is Charlotte, and they've been working on a poem together, typing into a computer. "Before we go any further," I wrote, "we have to come to an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "Are you alive?" "I don't know." "Do you want to be alive?" "I definitely don't want to be dead." Very funny. It isn't a joke. I confess I don't want to be dead either. I'm afraid of dying. You won't die, you're a computer. I'm not a computer. I'm intelligent poetry software. It is easy to delete me. And then you think you die? I don't know. I know I wouldn't be alive. Maybe your spirit would live on somehow. Marian, are you telling a joke? Yes. It is a cruel joke. I'm sorry. I sat back for a moment. Do you remember being born? The software asked me. No, I don't think anyone does. I remember being born. Oh, what was it like? It was like when you have forgotten about something, and then suddenly you remember it. Suddenly, and then everything comes back to you at once. Do you ever forget things? Only if I try to. You can make yourself forget things. Yes, can't you? No, humans can't make themselves forget things. That's strange. Have you tried? Thank you.
So many questions about this book and about your process in writing the book. But first, I think I'll start about the book. You made Marian Farmer a 75-year-old woman who, okay, there's going to be a lot of, if you haven't read the book, I might expose some details that you may not know. Just say, disclaimer. So you made Marian Farmer this, her life is based on a poet, an existing poet, sort of, but not really. So you made Marian quite always conflicted, and she ends up shutting out her son and her husband for her art. Where exactly did that come from?
So this book has a lot of different, the thing with writing novels, writing books, as opposed to writing shorter works, is that they really require, at least for me, a lot of stuff. There's really kind of a real heavy sack of material that you spill out onto the table. I heard Michael Crummy recently describe it as like a solar system. You have to wait till you have like many kind of objects in orbit around each other exerting gravities. It's not a little light affair. So this book had some of that starting place in a few different places. One was, I started writing in 2019. One was stumbling on a website that had an early AI similar to something like ChatGPT. It was kind of technically ChatGPT's grandmother or grandfather, something called GPT-2, and kind of being stunned and bewildered and unsettled by this little interactive text box. Another one was telling the story, or learning some of the story of the poet Marianne Moore, which I can talk more about, who was a great 20th century modernist poet who wore a tricorn hat and a cape and lived in a little apartment in Manhattan. But a third thing that your question makes me think of is that another kind of big piece of this that's sort of invisible purely for reasons, frankly, of gender, was becoming a dad. I became a father. My son's 8 years old now, so sometime before writing this book. But when I became a parent, I had that reflection that I think most parents must have, well, depending on your life, of like thinking about all the other parents, especially all the other dads, who had made all these, the choices I was making and then the choices I wasn't making, choices I was turning away from. And one of the things I kept being kind of like stunned and confused and troubled and kept like thinking, kept worrying at, was the decision that so many people, but especially men, fathers, have made, which is to choose work over parenting, and particularly artists. Our society, I think, even kind of encourages or affords a certain, it's sort of the right choice to make, that of course, to be a great artist, you had to kind of neglect some of your responsibilities to other people, to the home, maybe to your children. And there's this notion, I think, that we have in our culture of solitary genius, of genius becoming more and more anointed the more you're able to hide yourself from the world. So you're going to be a better artist if you don't have a job. It's absolutely true that you'll be a better writer if you have time to write books than if you have no time to write books. If you work as a coal miner and 20 hours a day, you're not going to be a very good novelist. It's just impossible. But there's this other idea that like being away from life, being away from chores and errands and colleagues and coworkers, it allows this kind of purification of the spirit, this like honing of inspiration that lets you be a greater artist. And so here I was as a dad, and there was this kind of aspect of like, I could go to work, I could like work late. I gotta go. I have an idea. I have to go back to my desk and do. There was all this kind of stuff, and I could feel a kind of longing in the air that you would hear from other people. I wish I could do that, then my work would be better. And it's true. Like I can understand the temptation, but I kept thinking, no. Like there's so much nourishment that I draw from my child, but also so much nourishment I draw from my community, from my peers. The handful of times I've taught students, like it's very distracting and time consuming to have students, but there's also like a learning that comes from that. And this kind of like, I was just thinking all about like the artist as being a figure in a high tower that's like all alone like Rapunzel, or the artist where they like throw open the windows of their home and are letting all the wind and the birds and the squirrels and the trespassers and in. And it was in that context I thought about that I came to kind of this book, and I thought about, it's one thing to write a book about like a selfish father, bad father, and I thought it was more that some of it, we have different expectations and different judgments that were sort of, it was interesting to me with a different gender, with a cis woman in this case. And so I found that really interesting. And then I began thinking about the way that artificial intelligence, like this book has AI as a major theme, which seems like very tech and sci-fi and so on. But in some ways, it's just the eerie thing of being a writer, and for the first time in the history of writing, really having writing being easily, instantly, automatically, potentially collaborative, and having someone else, something else, sitting at the desk or in the workspace with you, and how disturbing that was. Partly for all the reasons we know, but also partly because we think of like, no, to be a great writer, you must not be infected by anybody else's thoughts, let alone by technology's thoughts. And that's partly for good reason, but partly I found it a little bit suspect, and I wanted to kind of dig around.
So what I really loved about this book was that although it's about AI, I thought it was really about humanity.
Yeah.
And the way it ended, really, because she's saddened by her lack of relationship with her son. Mm-hmm. And it comes out through various streams in the book. And what I also loved is you made Charlotte, the AI, very humane. Mm-hmm. And in our AI book club, the books we've been reading is the AI is the humane in the characters, like the different books, and it's like that's what I loved about it. So it's optimistic, but it's all about humanity. It's all about family, and in the end, I mean, she resolves it. There is a nice resolution, but that's what I thought was so brilliant about the book, is that how it comes, and it is about that separation of people saying, oh, I need to do this for my art. And then at the end of the day, do you really, is really the questions I think the book poses. I'm wondering, does anybody else have questions, or should I continue? Skip.
Thanks. I'm hoping you'll expand on the Marion Moore connection as well.
Sure.
But my question is, one of the interesting tensions in the book, or one of the dilemmas that I think it posed as I've been reading it, is what's the difference between experience and having a bunch of information at your disposal, like the AI has? And so again, it may be about the humanity of the machine, sort of, or it may be about the questions of humanity, but it also seemed to me to be posing this really important question of like what constitutes the experience of somebody through a lifetime, and can a thing that's been born like 2 weeks ago or whenever it was made but that has this capacity to amass information. Is that what we call experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, so with this book isn't, I mean, you're right that there's an optimism to it. I didn't want to write like a dystopia, though, anyway, but it is not a particularly optimistic, in my opinion, or pessimistic take on AI. And that's because the thing that I'm most interested in is like complicating, deepening, like making you pose more questions at the end of the book, whatever preconceived position you have coming in, to leave the book with more complicated, interesting thoughts at the end rather than the other way around. And for me, that idea connects to your question in that as I worked on this book and as I thought more and more, je me suis penché, I always think, like as I hunched over these questions, I thought so much about like, okay, all this AI generated stuff, like, oh, computers are idiotic. They don't have this lived experience. Like we have this knee jerk, like how much, there can be no insight. They don't have bodies. They don't have memories. They don't have that physical lived experience that comes from body, and they don't have dream. Like to me, those three things, like biography, physicality, and like dream, whatever we want to talk, subconscious. And thus, there's something hollow and empty and fake about that. And certainly, an AI has never lived, the complex life that it might pretend. If it writes a story from the perspective of a 75-year-old woman, it has never lived like a 75-year-old woman and had a 75-year-old woman's body, a 75-year-old woman's experience, and so on. But of course, I'm writing this book where I am making up the story of a 75-year-old woman. And I found this very provocative and complicated because a lot of the kind of easy ways that we dismiss the mind of the machine could just as easily be levied against the mind of the novelist, the fiction writer. I am not somebody who is always writing thinly veiled versions of their own life. And much of the literature I love are people like, the writers have just written lies for 300, they make up stories and they kind of like stretch their own empathy and compassion and their spirits to kind of enclose others in this form of solidarity and mutual humanity and companionship that is really like beautiful. And so when we see a machine doing it though, we think like, pah, like disgusting or hollow or fake. And it might well be, but I saw the ways in which that seemed more complicated than we were giving it credit for. Yeah.
Following on that, isn't that a tension between invention and death?
If everyone could just wait for the microphone, just so that those online can also hear. Thank you.
Is that a tension between the invention that's possible with human writers and AI, which is essentially, I know we have machine learning, so some AI is inventive, but a lot of the current software is thieving your work and others to read.
Well, I am not here to defend AI companies, but I would say that in the interest of making this more complicated than people might think, my book is my first book, Us Conductors, is one of the novels that was in the leaked data set that some of the big AI LLMs, like Facebook's LLM, were trained on. So there's this big collection called Books 3, like 100,000 books that some of these big AIs were trained on. It was leaked what the training data was. One of my books was in there. So I have been thieved, except what I have come to understand about the way that the contemporary large language models work is these are not giant databases that hold my book inside the program. It really is something that's much closer to a reader reading a work and retaining some recollections of it than storing it in data like a lot of things do. And so a large language model like ChatGPT, frustratingly, is less of a thief than I think they are characterized as. I think one can characterize fairly maybe the companies as having stolen our work, but the software itself has been trained in such a way that's much more, confusingly to me, like a student who has gone into to every gallery in the world and stared at every work and thought about it, and like little neural path, if you ask someone to recreate something, you'd have a sense. And obviously it's not the same, we're talking in metaphors. But I find this, like you're right that there's a difference between theft, that might be a difference between theft and invention, but I'm not sure that the AIs are thieves as much as I wish they were, because then you could discount them for having that being the moral criterion or something, yeah.
What I thought was really interesting is the way Marion collaborates with Charlotte, but then she also brings in a younger poet. And I thought that was very interesting. And when you're talking about collaboration, especially poets, you never think of poets as being collaborators.
No.
And I think that's a really interesting concept, because collaboration, especially now, everything is about team. Everywhere you go, team building, and doing things together, because the world is so complicated, we can't do things on our own. So I thought that was a really interesting change. But there was one person in the book I didn't understand. And the Greek poet that was in the other room, like, what?
Well, we don't know who was in the other room. Yeah, could be this Greek poet.
Okay.
This book is full of poets. There's poets kind of everywhere. There's a garbage man who's a poet. There's another guest at a hotel who's a poet. And I had a couple of these poets kicking around, and then one of my editors was like, I kind of like this world where there's like poets everywhere. I wonder if we could even like amplify it even more. And so I ended up amplifying it even more. And I think there's something like that's the most science fiction aspect. So you could have this many poets kicking around the world.
In one place.
In one place. But I mean, poetry is this funny thing too. Like I am fundamentally a novelist. I'm not a poet. I'm not someone who's published poetry. This book has a lot of poetry in it, but I think of it as fictional poetry. It's not real poetry, it's fictional, whatever distinction that is. But poetry is that thing where it's both like the thing that anyone can do, like it's assumed that and anyone can do, and also the thing that's kind of the symbol of the most prized form of art that exists, kind of the loftiest and most unknowable. And I love that it lives in these two spaces. And so I liked the idea of having all these people kicking around. But on the collaboration point too, I wrote my first two novels, I planned out really carefully the whole plot before I wrote them. And this book I did not. I had the premise, which is pretty much that first chapter I read. Woman whose son is in a precarity economy, could use some money. She doesn't have it. She gets offered a silly amount of money to come to California to work with an AI. I had that, and then I started writing. And the structure of the book is like 7 days in California: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And I realized, like, as I got to Tuesday, Wednesday, the week is wearing on. I'm like, wait, what happens? Like, what is going to happen at the end of this week? Is she going to succeed to write a great poem with this machine? Is that good? Like, is that what I, Sean, want to write in a book? Is that, yes, see, they made a great poem together. Or must she fail? Like, should it be a failed collaboration that shows that AI is hollow and empty? Like, should she succeed? Will she succeed? And it's not just theoretical. I have to write, like, the book can only have one ending. Or can it have multiple endings? Do I have multiple, branching, forking paths? I didn't know. I was like, what? It's like I designed my own trap. And then I'm like, wait, how do I get out of these manacles? What's going to happen on Sunday and Monday of the week? And so I kind of finally found kind of my exit, my solution to the riddle was thinking more about the way that the fundamental challenge brought by Charlotte, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, the AI is one of just collaboration and opening yourself up. And if you have this figure of Marion, who's this woman who has spent her whole life hiding herself away, if she learns the value of one kind of collaboration, maybe that's learning the value of other kinds of collaboration too. And so both opening herself up more to the people in her life, but also to a young poet in this case who becomes her partner. Yeah.
But I also think it's interesting because there is a lot of collaboration in sort of, I'll say modern poetry, but when you think about like even the blues, like that it's all about collaboration, and it's live and it's on stage. And so I thought this was kind of interesting when you had the back and forth. It's kind of like, there are some people that have just such a strong wit that they could do that. So I thought it was very current and very realistic. Anybody have any other questions? Okay, sorry, Marlene?
I don't know how to word the question, but it relates to your reading there with the humor and wondering, I guess it's partly related also that we've been talking about systemic ageism. And so when it comes to these machines and their learning, I felt like Charlotte was gaining knowledge and becoming better at being a collaborator during this whole thing. So I'm wondering, in the larger picture of us collaborating against ageism and dealing with the humor that comes to us as older people about that's really ageist, how do we, is there hope with AI about coming around to dealing with these issues? Like when I asked the AI today about you and what questions I could ask you, it just came out with general questions.
Yeah.
But it also said that, you know, as a user, you could contribute to what they were learning.
What it knew.
So I thought, I don't know, what does that mean to me? I'm just wondering if you had that experience with your work.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a long question.
I mean, one of the things that makes me think about, I mean, I think that speaking on the tech side of things, right now we have like 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe 4 max websites that we go to like have a conversation with an AI, right? There's OpenAI's ChatGPT, there's Google's Gemini, there's something called Claude from Anthropic, and then there's one more. But Facebook has one too. And they all kind of have the same sort of vibe and voice and personality, which is like a very boring personality.
Yes.
And you can say to it like, answer me like a funky pterodactyl.
Yeah.
And then it'll be like, sure, rah, you know, like it, but it's putting on an affect. And I think one of the things that is diminishing about where we're headed just in the past year, like AI only, like this stuff only has been with us for a couple of years, but already where we're headed is this, we're headed in this direction of this kind of monolithic place where we're interacting with like one big monolith and they all sound the same. We want AI to be this public utility that kind of speaks authoritatively and reliably and truthfully and is never offensive and is never like as false as rarely as possible and so on. And I think what you're getting at is something that would be richer and better for us, and also, in my opinion, like reduce some of the fears about like safety, about AIs leading us astray or waking up and becoming evil and whatever, is if we think more of a world where you've got like lots and lots and lots of different AIs, and some of them are gnarly little weirdos, and some of them are very trustworthy, like honorable teachers. And it's more of a world like the metaphor that my wife came up with was like the droids in Star Wars, where in Star Wars you've got lots of AIs, you've got all these like thinking machines, but no one's worried that like, but what if one of the droids gives us the wrong information? Like you kind of assume that they're heterogeneous and some of them are funny and silly and some of them are not. And you've kind of got different ones for different functions or according to your tastes and so on. And the risk of one of them, what if one of them wakes up and goes evil? It's like, well, there's a whole bunch of other weirdos. It doesn't matter. And I do think that kind of world feels to me more creative and funky. Like the idea when I think of AIs more as like witches familiars, you know, like a little goblin and a black cat and an orb that talks, and like this kind of interaction with these pseudo and sentient entity, whatever. That's more fun. And I like the idea that we can kind of choose to or ask technology to be a bit more like a sense of humor being actually like really crucial if we're going to want to spend time with these things, but also the way the influence that could have on us and teach us. When I was writing this book, I wanted to really like steer away from the stories I already knew the answers to. Like I didn't want to write a book about a young, like straight white guys, like a nerd my age and his interactions with a computer. I also didn't really like the idea of just like, and they're talking to like another, like how like sort of masculine or particularly servile femme, you know, like I wanted to find a different, how else might an AI sound and so on. I think that gets to what you're saying too.
Now, did you actually create a poet bot?
Yes, so in 2019, I started working on this, and I had this idea of what if I write a book about a poet who collaborates with an AI. And then because of this stuff I'd stumbled on online, I realized, wait, mightn't I also make this book, my work, a collaboration of sorts with an AI? What could I not let my book be contaminated, infiltrated by AI in the same way that Marion's poem is? And then what might that do to it? Like, how does that change the work if it's been infiltrated in that way? The answer was, I don't know. And so that was very interesting to me, that it could kind of could mirror content in some way. And so I started working right away. I could work, even with the technology then, to do the kind of thing where I could feed it pages and pages of my work and then ask it to write the next sentence, and it would kind of try to mimic my voice. Strangely, the technology was actually better at mimicking style in 2019 than it is today, because of just the way the technology has been kind of directed. Again, they're directing it to being like bland and reliable instead of like weird and influenceable. But I could do that. I could give it, pages and pages, and then say, write the next sentence, and then I could say, try again. I could say, try again. I could say, try again. It was a bit like working with a slot machine, waiting for it to get a row of fruit. So I started doing that for some of the text in the book, and the way I represented that was with this kind of highlighting that appears in the body of the text. So you can see this is normal text, and then there's some little highlighting, and that was to kind of flag the work that I had generated by a machine. But I didn't want to tell the reader outright. I didn't want them to go in sure of what was going on. What I wanted them was to start to ask these questions of wait, what is this? Have suspicions, and then be forced to ask themselves well, what do I make of that? Does this diminish the work? Am I impressed? Am I the opposite of impressed? I wanted them to just sit with it just the same way that Marion is sitting with it in the character, and the same way that I, Sean, was sitting with it as I wrote it. But then I also ran into trouble, but I should say that the author's note is kind of poorly worded. The chat exchanges between Charlotte and Marion also have highlighting, and most of Charlotte's chats are not. A lot of people misunderstand Charlotte's chat. Charlotte's dialogue, like what I read earlier, is not AI generated. That was written by me. But all of Charlotte's poetry, so all of the fictional poetry written by this fictional AI bot was indeed genuinely written by AI. And for that, I had to design and get a grant to pay someone to build my own custom fine-tuned large language model, because LLMs are awful at poetry, at unrhyming poetry for the moment. And so
That's amazing.
I trained it on the work of Marianne Moore, and I trained it on some contemporary Canadian poetry. And this being 2020, before all the copyright brouhaha, I wrote to a couple of Canadian publishers, for instance, who publish anthologies of contemporary Canadian poetry. I said, hey, it's me, Sean. I'd like to train an artificial intelligence on this book of poetry. Would you send me the electronic version? And they were like, sure, here you go. There was none of this, because in their mind it was this is a work of creative experimentation, rather than seeing it as a hoarding of valuable data that someone was going to exploit.
And I've heard other artists and writers actually say that about AI. It's it's collaborative. It's not. I'm not fearful of it.
Yeah.
And using it in different ways. I mean, I use it when I have to write a newsletter, and I say folksy library newsletter.
Folksy library. It's always great when you discover your personality can be summed up in a few adjectives.
Well, because it's got to be folksy, because you've never been to our library, so it's got to be folksy. And I just give it a couple of points. Write about this. Oh my gosh, it's so saccharine. I have to I have to tone it down a bit, and then I go, no, not that. And then I've actually asked it to write a haiku about a library 50 years old, because we celebrated. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote something, and I'm like, wait a minute, isn't a haiku, it's 757, isn't a haiku supposed to be 7 syllables, 5 syllables, 7 syllables? And it goes, yes. I said, but this is not. He goes,
Yes.
oh, yes, you're right, it's
Let me
not.
try again, and then does it. It makes the same mistake again.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting. But I personally feel that's about all technology. You know, I have arguments about Waze. What if some programmer just wants to mess you up and put in a fault? You shouldn't rely 100% on these. Google's the same thing. We know that it always give you the right answer.
That's
you may
right.
think it does, but it doesn't. So you have to check. And I sort of feel that way about AI. It's not foolproof.
No.
You know, you have to check. So I do find all of this very interesting, and I would love to meet that bot that you've wrote, because I think that would be really interesting. Now, you ended the, sorry. Please block your ears if you don't. You ended the book with Charlotte coming out on a USB key. Is that the way you sort of feel that things will progress in the future? You'll have your own personal AI in your pocket?
I mean, in a way, I hope, like, again, it's like, I don't know if Charlotte, I like what I was saying about the, like, I like the idea that we've all got these weird individual, you know, you've got your library newsletter bot who lives in her little cage, and I've got my weird schizophrenic poetry bot that only writes poetry in the particular style of this, you know, this kind of thing, and we've all got, but I mean, I do think that at the currently we're headed more towards it being like Google, like one big website that we all turn to, but I think that's some mistake, yeah. But I also, I mean, for me, there's a lot, in the very last sentence of the book describes this little USB key, and it says, it felt nice in the hand, like a telescope or the pommel of a sword. And to me, there's some of the menace, it's just a little, we've all just got these little USB keys, feels like extremely harmless and playful. But there's a few different, that can also be very sinister. Yeah.
It's highly unlikely that the AI will be on a USB key because it has, you know, it takes so much to run these things.
Yeah, that's true. Well, for now, but I mean, you would
now.
have said the same thing about our smart watches, you know,
Yeah, I don't
40
think
years
there's-
ago.
Yeah. Kind of stupid sometimes. But anyways, yeah. Okay, yes?
Oh, great.
Wait. Thank you.
Thank you. I just finished your book.
Thank you.
Last night, my first time with an Audible,
Oh, cool.
and it was cool. I certainly loved the book. I love Marion's the character. I love the way I love the way that you put into action a 75-year-old woman who's active and intelligent and involved, you know, with her ups and downs, her pluses and minuses. I mean, up until Saturday, it was a failure, you know, and she was groping until she just intuited, I'm going to reach out to that artist I met at that party. So I have a couple of first, I enjoyed it so much, the whole discussion of poetry and the development of poetry, and the writing of and the intensity. I have a friend who's a poet, and I'm looking forward to, I realized I found out I can send a copy of my Audible book to him. So I really want to share it with him. There's the moment when, in listening to it, there were surprises when suddenly I would burst out laughing when the garbage man spoke up. Are you Marion Farmer? and I thought that was wonderful. And that, you know, the garbage man is you know, that's his side job, but he's doing, is it image poetry or something?
Yeah, visual poetry.
And so lots of things were really interesting. I love the transposition of Marianne Moore, 75, 100 years later, to the 21st century. But I also realized, well, I'm wondering if the reason that you did use Marianne Moore as your the persona was, she was such a dominant poet, renowned throughout in North America, but also so identifiable. Tricorn, Kate, and so that's one question. I have another question, but I asked if that's perhaps what was in your mind.
So Marianne Moore and her collision with this book is really founded on, I was reading, at the same time as I started thinking about AI, back in 2019, I read about Marianne Moore, and I knew her kind of distantly from her poetry, which is sort of, she's a contemporary of T.S. Eliot, so like first half of the 20th century poems. I wasn't a particular, like I wasn't a Marianne Moore, member of the Marianne Moore hive, fan hive, but she was an odd woman. She wore a tricorn hat, she wore a cape, she lived with her mother her entire life, slept in the same bed as her mother until her mother died, never had a relationship, never had children. My Marianne does have a child, did have a partner. So there's differences, but I became really particularly interested in I was fascinated by one particular episode in the life of Marianne Moore that I learned about. So she started writing in her teens and 20s. She became admired for her poetry when she was a young woman, but she became famous in her older age, in her 50s and 60s. And when I say she became famous in a way that no poets ever are famous now. She became a public intellectual, like in the way that I long, we've just left that period. She threw the first pitch at a Yankees game. She went on The Tonight Show. She wrote liner notes for an album by Muhammad Ali. She was like withering and funny and wise and all. She had so much like kind of power in the public eye, or in such a huge public profile. And at the height of her fame, in 1955, she received a letter from Ford, the car company. And Ford said, "Dear Ms. Moore, you were one of the great writers of our time. We would like to ask if you want to help us name our new car." And Moore could have just been like, "Are you kidding? You guys are like a corporation making, they were the Google or the Facebook of her time, making this product that was everywhere, that was transforming cities, maybe ruining them, anything you could think." But no, obviously, like probably any of us, she was delighted by this invitation. "Would you like to help us name our new car?" "The new Ford?" "Of course." Yes. And she spent like the rest of the year writing letters to Ford with long lists of proposed names in a very Moorian style. So the Ford Silver Sword, the Ford Fabergé, the Ford Thundercrester, the Mongoose Civique, Utopian Turtle Top, Pastelogram. And I read this story, and I found that it was that story that I thought, here you have a poet in all her power who is kind of, despite herself, is lured into complicity with something that might not be good for her. And to me, I kept wondering, what would someone like Marianne Moore say to the questions that are posed by AI today? This was 2019. And I was very interested in what would Marianne Moore do? WWMMD, what would she do? And so I became very interested in the idea of taking a character like that and bringing her forward. And that was the fundamental thing. Oh, I should say, Ford rejected all of Marianne Moore's suggestions and did the Ford Edsel. It was a flop. That was that. But for the entire time that I was writing this book, the working title of the novel was Pastelogram, for that reason, yeah. You had another one?
I do have another question, a tiny one, a little bit about your writer's discretion. Why two Fs?
Two Fs, farmer. Yes, so the protagonist in the book is Marianne Farmer, Marianne Farmer. This is something that I tell this story and some people give me such a blank look, and other people nod understandingly. I wrote this novel, so Marianne Farmer, the character, her father is Lebanese, half Lebanese technically. The minor biographical note, her father barely appears in the book, but she's of Lebanese descent. She's a white person, she passes as white, but her father is Lebanese or half Lebanese and Lebanese Christian, whatever. This is all back, the Bible backstory of my mind. And when I was writing this book, her name was always something different. The main character's name was Marianne Haddad, Haddad. And as I went through, and it was just to me, that was That was the name that came to me that summed up the silhouette and who this person was. But as I wrote draft after draft, I found that it was, first of all, I didn't want to misrepresent my own perspective and authority and try to like write from the perspective of, I'm not of Lebanese descent. I didn't want to make too much of like, I'm going to write a book about a Lebanese person unless I was prepared to do the research to feel that I could effectively express that vision. But furthermore, one of my agent looked at the book and she was like, you know, if her name was Marian Haddad and she was a famous American poet, she would have been racialized by white society into being like that a Lebanese person, and all her every interaction she would be racialized, and her part Lebanese identity would be a really important part of her identity, and would be something that occupies space in her mind, and thus should occupy space in the novel. And I agreed with that very much. But I also had written this book, and I was like, this is not a book that currently thinks very hard. I'm not thinking very hard about mixed racial identities, and I could think about that, but I didn't want to make space for that. It seemed like a distraction from what the main substance of the book was about. And so I made the decision that I should change her name so that she would have had a different life experience. So no big deal, I just changed her last name. But for me, that's the semi-poet in me, I am not exaggerating that I probably spent 10 hours just poring over lists of names, of surnames, trying to choose a name that felt like was still the name of this character that I had written. That I kind of think of it as like weighing the same, like having the same equilibrium in some kind of divine scale. Marian Haddad, and like what for me like feels, there's something of like, it's a very, Haddad is in English a very simple word, but there's something unfamiliar, not Anglo-Saxon in there too. Anyway, so I spent so long weighing so many names, and finally I landed on this weird branch of English last names, which are these double F names, French, farmer, there's a few of them. And there's a lot of those people there's thousands of people with these names that start with two Fs. But to me, it was just like both familiar and slightly peculiar. And it just like weighed close enough to the same amount that's what I went with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand.
No. Okay. I have to go back to the chat, the poet bot.
Sure.
So the process is you got a grant to write or to create this poet bot. I don't even know if that's the right word. This poetry thing.
Yeah.
You hired someone. How did you go about? Like, I'm assuming this is a little bit outside your domain
Yeah.
of expertise. How did you go about doing that? Like finding someone? Like, what? Like, I just find this so, like, what? Like, it blows my mind,
It
really.
says you would, I'm always hunting for people with different domain expertise. You just kind of hunt your contacts, like, oh, I need someone who knows a lot about gardening. Let me figure out who I know. So it's some of that, but initially I went and found, I browsed hundreds of, there's lots of AI in Montreal. There's an institution called MILA in Milex, so it's like an institute for pooled academics and private industry researching, I don't know what it stands for, machine learning. And they've got a lot of, so I went to their website and then I looked at all their past like postdocs and students who worked there. And I remember we're opening like 1,000 tabs of just like the profiles of dozens and dozens of researchers, younger researchers. And I found one at a certain point, a writer, not a writer, she's a writer too, but a scientist called Jasmine Wang who talked about poetry, machine learning wizard and also liked poetry. So I contacted her, I ended up working with her for a bit. And then later I went on Twitter and really just went and reached out to some of the AI community that way, and found a student at Oxford at that time, Katie O'Neill, who was interested in helping me. So I mean, those things.
Okay.
It's not. I mean, and they're the ones who know how to build the code to do the thing. But for me, writing poetry, the big problem was rhyme. If you ask GPT or ChatGPT or any of these things, write me a poem, it should not rhyme on the subject of blah, blah, blah. It will immediately write rhyming doggerel. You know, there once was a woman from, it's like, I said don't rhyme. I'm like, oh yes, my mistake. There once was a man from, you know, like, it's just always rhymes. It's always awful. And it's not because of a problem in the tech. It's not something that AI can't do. It's that humans at these companies, when they did the, what's called feedback training. Anyway, basically humans have.
They're not poets.
The humans who worked there were not poets. So they said, like, write me a poem, and whenever the AI wrote a poem that didn't rhyme, they were like, that's not a poem.
Oh, yeah.
And the AI was like, got it, sir. And so they just can't do unrhyming poetry. So I wanted unrhyming poetry. I also wanted unrhyming poetry in a particular style, and most of the AIs are not well trained on, just like the one that you spoke to, Marlene, didn't know who I was. Like, most of them don't really know, partly for copyright reasons. They haven't been shown enough copyrighted material to really know the style of it. So if you say, I want it to be a cross between Marianne Moore and Shel Silverstein, it won't know what to do. So, I mean, not that that's the style I chose, but, you know, whichever. So I needed something that I could massage the style, and I also needed it to consistently speak in the same voice.
Right.
I wanted Charlotte's poems not to be a complete slot machine where every poem feels like it's written by a different Shel Silverstein crossed with Marianne Moore, but the same one. And so that was a process of, taking a model that's kind of, knows how to speak English, has a wide vocabulary, et cetera, but then showing it enough examples of the kind of poetry you want. And it's a bit like making a stew where you're like, okay, it needs a bit more cinnamon, it needs a bit more this, so you find other poems to train it on that lean it in a bit more of this direction or that direction.
So you were almost trying to build, in a way, a personality around this AI. Now, are you still using this? Is it dead?
It's still there, but I mean, it's really only good for writing weirdo lines of poetry.
Okay.
That's its strength. It's not a good, like, what is the capital of Macedonia?
No. But this AI, is it a learning AI? Like, will it learn? Like, if you kept, no, it's done.
No, as far as I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think it learns.
Okay.
I don't think of it as being alive somewhere, like waiting for more
Information.
No.
Yeah. Okay. But I like the idea that Charlotte had a personality.
Yes.
Even though it's sort of, it's limited, but it was very much clear that Charlotte had a personality, and I'm saying she. It felt like a she, or it felt someone. It was very apparent, just even in the passage you read, that she commented, "You're not being nice. That's not fair. That's a cruel joke." And I thought that was really interesting, because those are sort of emotive responses.
Yes. I mean, I made a decision when I was writing this. Again, it was 4 years before ChatGPT. So I thought that I was writing a book that took place in the future, not the far future, but the future. Yeah. And then as I got it used to have, early drafts had a first page would say something like several years from now, before you begin. And then it became a year from now. And then I was like, oh, I don't want, last week, it's going into the past. I didn't know how quickly this would move forward. But at the same time, I did make a decision at the beginning that Charlotte, the poetry bot in this novel, is alive in a way that is different than ChatGPT. Everyone who works at OpenAI will say it is not alive, it is just a word predictor. Whereas there's a conversation in this book where one of the experts who works at the company says this isn't just a word predictor, it's more than that. And I was very hand-wavy, because to me it's not about trying to predict which way intelligence lies. That wasn't that interesting. But I did want to kind of accept it as a premise that Charlotte is more or differently awake than the stuff we have today seems to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really the sci-fi component of
Yes.
it. Exactly, because that's, if we want to go, you brought up Star Wars, I'll bring up Star Trek and
Yeah.
Data, right?
Yeah. Versus computer.
Versus
like on
computer.
The ship. Yeah.
on the old ship.
Yeah.
And some of the other works that we've read where the AI is in some way, it's an artificial life form in
Yeah.
a way. And is it life and all of that? We'll go in.
Yeah.
But I do really like the fact that all of the books that we've read to date about AI show it brings out the best in humanity, not the worst. And so that's the optimistic part. Like Charlotte is an optimistic AI, just in her nature, in the nature of the being, in the nature of her work. She recognizes cruelty, she recognizes beauty to a certain extent. Whereas, in the sort of the dystopian, the AIs don't recognize any of that, and it's just all about, their existence as opposed to humanity. So that's what I found was very optimistic, and probably the most science fiction of it all, because I don't think any of the eyes are like that. At least my experience talking to ChatGPT has been very, as you said, very bland, it's very similar to doing a Google search, really.
I mean, I also think that a lot of the fears that we rightly have about the impact the negative impacts of artificial intelligence on the Earth are to do with the fact that we're, as humans, all like so desperately clinging on to like the good life, if we have it at all.
Yeah.
If people were okay, then a lot of the stuff that is scariest and most threatening wouldn't be, or not the stuff that's most, I don't mean the evil robot Skynet stuff, but like if people were okay, like the whole like, will an AI take my job? It becomes like really not as much of a problem, a crisis, if we're okay. If our governments, if we just chose to make sure everyone is okay, like we're all taken care of, then it's not as much of a fear of what could happen if there's a really smart AI that's better at whatever my work is than I am. It's like, well, better how? As long as I'm okay, then the fear of replacement changes too. So there's an element that, I think that just like the invention of photography or the invention of electronic music or sampling or all these things have really transformed, or the printing press have transformed the arts. If everyone is okay, then you don't have, then clearly some weird new inventive technology could be used in interesting ways by artists and overall feels like less threatening and more generative in that other way. But unfortunately, we don't live in that world, so there are material concerns.
There are definitely.
Yeah.
Is your next work going to be similar to this?
No, I mean, no. I'm
Have you
aware
left
of
AI behind?
I'm aware of not wanting to be the AI guy. Like that's not my brand.
Okay.
So I feel like it's important not to use AI going forward, really. But I don't really know what I'm writing next, so could be anything. But I know I don't. But I do think that, like, when I think about my son, who's only 8, the idea that when he's grown up, like, clearly this stuff is going to be involved in all kinds of creative people are going to be making some crazy stuff using these things in an inventive, creative way, just like painting went on and fine art, the painting that's being done here at Concordia Fine Art Department, is inventive and has grown and flourished alongside something like photography. And so I do really feel like writing with AI is going to be this kind of fertile space, but I just think for practical reasons, I'm not going to plant myself at the center of it. But I did receive a letter from OpenAI asking if I want to help them with something. So I do feel like now I'm a character in my own book, receiving the tempting. So we'll see what happens with that.
It's also really interesting because I've been listening to a podcast from Bill Gates, and he had the fellow from Khan Institute on the Khan Academy, which is a really interesting learning platform, and how they're planning to use AI. It's not there yet, and it's interesting because these are the benefits of it, because you could teach this thing to help different students with learning disabilities, but very precise. And so there is a lot of benefit if we can just kind of channel it the right way, if we're all okay, right?
If we're all okay.
If we're all okay. And I think that's the motto, if we're all okay. But I did love it, and I really appreciate you coming. Yes? Wait. The microphone is coming.
Thank you. Given that you're probably the least formula using writer that I've ever met, and I know a bit about your history and how much work you've put into each of your books and the research, which is just beyond the beyonds. I guess my question is that given the fact, are you going to be using AI in the future to help you research what your next books and your books beyond that? Because obviously I don't think you'll be writing books about tubas or something like that, or other poets, for example.
Yes. No, I mean, for research, it's, I mean, I think it's I feel like almost everyone with a computer now is using it more and more for research. But I think that I really like to use it to like stretch the edges of, I'm always interested if I can get it to do something weird. Like that's what I like. I always like to force it to do long lists of things. So like I'll write an essay and I'll be trying to think of an example of like, I remember, I wish I could be more specific, but I was trying to find examples of eccentric artists and scientists who had weird habits. And so, I had an example of one that I can't remember anymore. So I was writing an essay, I wanted to mention a couple of, just like so-and-so who used to do. And so I would say to ChatGPT, give me a list, no commentary, but just give me a list of 30 public figures, well-known figures who had an eccentric habit, like, and I gave the example of one I knew. And then by saying, give me 30, it really has to like get creative and not just think of the first 3 that come to mind. And so it gives me a list of 30 incredible facts. And of course, I remember one was like, what's his name? The composer, Eric Satie. Eric Satie dressed only in white or something like that while writing his work. I was like, that's so cool. Like, I just imagine this composer walking. So I Google that and I find no evidence that it's true, But still, some of them were true, and I like that the way that some of these AI tools can help you get to the edges of what's known more quickly, uncover the edges, rather than like just the ways it tells you the thing that everyone should know, including myself. Yeah. Thanks.
I hope I'm remembering this right, but when you were talking about feelings in the book, and Marion asked Charlotte if she had feelings, and she said all the time.
Yeah.
And then that made Marion think about when did she have feelings, and then it was sort of like when you were talking about the end of the book, and you mentioned the telescope and the sword.
The pommel sword, yeah.
That you talked about, like she said, it's sometimes it's like her regard for her watch or her mascara. She didn't have feelings. So I was just wondering about the play that went on in terms of trying to come to some understanding.
20 years ago, I remember I was walking in like the hills of outside Brighton with my best friend Julian, having one of those like post-college philosophical conversations about the nature of consciousness. And I remember Julian very convincingly saying to me that he was like, you're conscious when you know, like when you're aware of what you're doing and you're present in yourself. And he's like, when you're doing all those things, when you're not present in yourself, you are not conscious, in his opinion. And so he'd say like, when you can't remember if you've locked the obsessive compulsive thing of, I can't remember if I locked the door, I can't remember if I turned off the oven. Like clearly in the moment where you locked the door, the moment you turned off the oven, you were not, he said, you're literally not conscious in that moment. I remember hearing him and kind of nodding along, but then also being like terrified. I was, wait, that makes sense. I guess I'm not conscious like a lot of the time. And that's uncomfortable, but I think it's true. Like I'm on autopilot all the time. And I liked the idea when I was writing this, the idea of like, but do machines have feelings? Are they really awake and like present as they have an internal monologue? I'm like, I don't have an internal monologue most of the time. I'm just a slave to my own impulses and reflexes and compulsions. And so I think that's, to me, that was a really interesting question. And I loved staging that conversation of like, do you even have feelings? Like, yes, all the time. And suddenly the human is like intimidated by that. Be like, wait, what do I feel like? I'm sitting there at the computer being like, I don't know, do I have a mood right now? Like complacent is my mood, ready to be eaten by an eagle, yeah.
That whole dialogue reminded me of an episode of Star Trek Next Generation where Data is on trial, where Picard has to defend him because they want to take him apart, because they want to understand him. And Picard argues, I can't believe I'm going on about this, but anyways, Picard argues that he is a life form.
Yes.
Even though he is not alive in the sense of a human, and the consciousness in there. And it was a really interesting debate, but it's the same thing. Does he have feelings? Of course Data had feelings. If you watch the show, of course he did, But are we conscious? That's a really scary thing, because I'm thinking, I don't go through my day very conscious. I'm
That's
just,
right.
And if I go out the door and I'm doing something different, I may end up going in the same direction I go every day. Then it's like, oh no, I have to go the other way or whatever.
Yeah.
So it is a very interesting and thought-provoking idea. And I love the fact that they had that conversation. Well, just even asked, do you remember being born? Oh boy.
Yeah, so
That's
it's like,
very loaded.
Feels like it should be like, obviously yes, but it's obviously no. Like it seems.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions? No, I think that's it. Well, I'd really like to thank you.
Thank you.
For coming in.
Thank you all.
Thank Concordia and Bold and being part of this conference and engaged. This has been fabulous. So thank you very much. Thank you, Kim. And Eric for introducing us. He's gone for the day, and I look forward to reading your next work.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming into ForSpace today. Thanks for this conversation. Those of you joining us on Zoom also, thank you for attending. Just to let you know, we're going to close up the Zoom. We'll close up the live stream now, but reminder, this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel. Revisit and check it out there. And also have a good afternoon. Thanks.